My first video game console was this cursed gadget, the Mega Joy 2 8000. At some point around 2002, my parents brought it home from the dollar store, claiming it was the only thing there that cost $10. It's clearly modeled after the Nintendo 64 controller, but of course, minus the joystick. The Mega Joy 2 is a bootleg Famiclone, or in other words, it's a plug-and-play TV game with 76 pirated Nintendo games on it, which are then repeated 8,000 times in its on-screen selection menu. Despite being clearly a dodgy piece of junk, this happened to be in the right place at the right time and ended up being foundational to my taste in video games. But how does this thing even exist? What is a Famiclone? What makes this one illegal? Welcome back to Planet Clue. Let's find out together, shall we? So, back in 1983, Nintendo released the Family Computer, often shortened to the Famicom, to the Japanese market. It's a tiny little cartridge-loading game console with two permanently attached controllers that dock onto the sides of the unit. And in 1985, the Famicom got a redesign for the American market and rebranded as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short. It's the iconic gray box we've all come to love over here in the States. The dichotomy of these two designs will always be so fascinating to me. The Famicom is so joyful and toy-like, while the NES is bulky and industrial like a VCR. After the video game crash of 1983, retailers were wary about stocking anything related to home video game consoles, so they couldn't exactly throw the Famicom onto store shelves over here and expect it to sell. So they gave it a design pass to try and convince retailers and customers that the NES was something different. They didn't even call this a video game console. It was a control deck for a toy gun and a weird robot. And it worked, but naturally not without some caveats. NES games were very expensive, and there was like a 50-50 chance that whatever game you picked up was gonna not be fun to play at all, because back then it was a bleeding edge medium. Rental culture was such a godsend for the NES at the time, because you could head to the video store and rent a game for a weekend on the cheap, and if it sucked, you could return it and not rent it again, or if you really liked it, you knew what to ask for Christmas. A lot of NES games were experimental, bizarre, or incredibly cryptic by today's standards. You had to read the manual that came with the game, and sometimes it would still be confusing. The internet, as we understand it today, did not exist yet. You couldn't just Google it. And that's why Nintendo Power Magazine was so important to the NES ecosystem back in the day. It solved so many problems. I could have sworn up and down that I had an NES, like 80s Nintendo Power Magazine. I don't. This is the oldest one I have, and it's for Super Nintendo. So this is technically from the 90s. Just pretend this is from the 80s, okay? That's the best I got. Radicalize your game with a subscription to Nintendo Power. Are you stuck with the terrible, terrible Star Wars game from 1991 on NES? Well, we got maps, we got tips, we got everything you want to know. Are you stuck with the NES port of Smash TV? Well, here's everything you could possibly want to know about it, right? They got maps, passwords, maybe even cheat codes. I could only imagine what it was like to have Nintendo Power back in the day, to have rented Worm on NES, and then just folded out this glorious map, dude. Look at this sick F-Zero poster! This is so rad, dude. I dare not remove it. This thing is an artifact. They would give a top 30 recommendations for NES games. It made it so much easier to figure out what to prioritize when you're at the video store. Sure, Nintendo Power had a lot of advertising back in the day aimed directly at kids, but it was part of the ecosystem. It was almost like an extension of the games themselves. I am incredibly grateful that I got to experience a vertical slice of the NES experience using this stupid gadget when I was a kid. Playing those games on here was so much better than nothing. But there's no arguing with the fact that by the time NES games were in my periphery, I had already missed the boat by 20 years. I played these games stripped of their original context. I didn't get to read the manuals that came with the games. I didn't get to have a big stupid gray box in my house with the I didn't get to flip through the magazines or window shop for NES games at the video store. The only thing I can do is read about it and piece it together in retrospect because I was not there. But does that matter? Like, does any of that extra context really matter when you get down to it?
It's Fabletics time. It's Fabletics time. Thank you to Fabletics for sponsoring this video. If you've been looking to upgrade your workout gear and your wardrobe, Fabletics is the solution to both at once. These pieces are built for movement while not being limited to just the gym. They bring the comfort you expect from everyday wear, and they bring the function with the form, with lightweight, breathable fabrics, plenty of stretch, moisture-wicking materials, and I love me some zip pockets. Zip pockets are the future. Tell me I'm wrong. The biggest reason to check them out right now is that new VIPs can get 70 to 80% off their first order when you access the deal through my link. You can also score deals like $19 pants, $10 shorts, and $7 tees. The VIP membership is flexible too. You can skip the monthly payment between the 1st and the 5th of the month and keep the VIP pricing, which can still score you up to 50% off. So if you want to give Fabletics a shot, check out the link in the description, pinned comment, and this QR code right here. It's a limited time offer. These deals go fast and they sell out quick. Thanks to Fabletics for sponsoring this video. And now, on with the show.
Well, for me at first, definitely not. I was like 3 or 4 years old when I first got this thing. I wasn't even able to read yet, so it's not like a game manual or magazine would have been much help. But when I was a little older and I first got into the internet, I googled some of the games I played on the Mega Joy 2, only to find out I was playing 20-year-old NES games the whole time. Then I started digging into what the NES actually was, the games, the peripherals, the culture that surrounded it. All the history was so deeply intriguing to me. Nowadays, we're so used to video games being these massive, curated, expensive productions that take weeks or months to play through. By comparison, it's easy to reduce some bleepity-bloopity NES game down to one tiny ROM file, one single potato chip in a bag of potato chips. But for as long as I've been alive, nostalgia was already a core part of the discussion of the NES. I never got to experience that era firsthand, but my nostalgia is for retrospectively discovering the culture around it, seeing all the weird accessories, reading old magazines, and hearing other people's rose-tinted memories of what it was like back then. It added such a distinct warmth to the games themselves. And I would say that that context matters to me because now, every time I boot up an NES game, even if it's a crappy one, I imagine all the emotions and memories they've accumulated over the last 40 years. I think of all the times that somebody rented RoboCop on NES for a weekend and never forgot it. I would say that it significantly affects how I engage with NES games and especially how I feel about things like the Mega Joy 2. These kinds of bootleg consoles that played back pirated NES games were a dime a dozen by the time I got mine in the early 2000s. They showed up in flea markets, mall kiosks, dollar stores apparently, and they came in every shape and size imaginable. But one thing they all have in common is that they are all Famiclones, which is exactly what it sounds like, a clone of the Famicom. Unofficial Famicom and NES clones had already started appearing by the late 80s, but the technology got dramatically cheaper over time. By the late 90s, manufacturers were using what became known as an NES on a chip, which condensed most of the important hardware needed to reproduce an NES into a single inexpensive chip. That made it incredibly cheap to build stuff like this. You didn't need to reproduce an entire 80s motherboard anymore. You could just take one of those chips, surround it with a handful of cheap components, shove it into a cheap plastic shell, and congratulations. You got video games. The legality of the hardware itself is kind of a little complicated. The early Famiclones were made while Nintendo still held patents covering parts of the original hardware, but those patents eventually started expiring in the early to mid 2000s. These days, there's nothing inherently illegal about making a machine that functions like an NES, but there's a pretty obvious difference between cloning an NES and selling an NES clone with a bunch of commercial Nintendo games on it. Look at this. This one literally has an entire Famicom cartridge slot on the back, dude. Oh. Yeah, baby, look at this. This is insane. But you don't need the cartridge slot on this because it has a bunch of games already built into it, including Super Mario Bros. Now, don't get it twisted here, okay? I am avidly pro-piracy. I believe it is the right of the people to freely download a verified and curated set of NES ROMs. That's game preservation at its finest, and Nintendo can go kick rocks for all I care. But I draw the line at bootlegging. If you're gonna distribute pirated works, don't charge money for it. It is that simple. Unsurprisingly, Nintendo didn't take kindly to the fact that Mario and Donkey Kong were showing up on shoddy bootleg Famiclone consoles in American shopping malls. So they did what Nintendo does best, which is hot legal action. In December of 2004, the FBI raided 2 kiosks at the Mall of America, along with associated storage, and seized around 1,800 bootleg Famiclone consoles. The guy who owned the company selling them was Jonathan Cohen. His company was apparently buying these things finished for somewhere around $7 to $9 wholesale and reselling them for as much as $70. So I'm not trying to paint him as some completely oblivious minimum wage mall employee here. He owned the business, and he ultimately pleaded guilty to criminal copyright infringement. But the way this story sometimes gets retold is a little strange because I've seen Cohen described as the guy who made or produced the Power Player thing. I can't find any evidence that he actually did. As far as I can tell, he didn't design the thing, he didn't manufacture it. I can't find any indication that he actively decided to put Nintendo ROMs on it. But what we do know is his company purchased finished consoles wholesale and resold them, and his role in selling them ultimately got him sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. His His sentencing also ordered for him to pay for an anti-piracy advertisement featuring his own face and describing his punishment. I'm not pretending to know what the sentencing judge knew, and I'm not trying to exonerate the guy, but 5 years in prison, getting publicly humiliated and getting deported feels incredibly severe to me, especially considering that Cohen wasn't even particularly high up the food chain. 9 days after he pleaded guilty, the FBI carried out another series of raids in New York and New Jersey. This time they arrested 4 people connected to a much larger import operation and seized more than 60,000 power players. According to authorities, that operation had imported more than 280,000 bootleg consoles in just 4 months. If that doesn't get across how common these things were back in the day, I don't know what will. Nintendo's message was loud and clear: don't pirate our games. But it doesn't matter how loud you make an example out of someone, you just can't stop bootlegging. This is a portable Famiclone that I paid $1 for. One singular dollar for on AliExpress a few months ago. This is what $1 gets you. You get the device, you get a manual, you get this little AV cable, you get a little micro USB for charging. So you select English, and then right there at the top, there it is. Super Mario Brothers, right there. There it is. It has been over 20 years since Cohen was sentenced for reselling bootleg video games. And yet, Famiclones with pirated Nintendo games have arguably never been easier to get your hands on. May I remind you, 99 cents! And this is where my feelings about the whole thing start to get a little bit complicated. I shouldn't have to tell you, this device is absolute garbage. It has aggressive diagonal screen tearing, the screen isn't polarized correctly, the colors are wrong, the game is running too fast, and the controls, they're so rubbery and ugh. Not to mention, the plastic shell feels like it's about to dissolve in my hands. It is obvious, blatant copyright infringement, but I just can't bring myself to hate it because 24 years ago, I was at the opposite end of this. My parents didn't go out looking for an NES. They didn't curate a retro game collection. They bought a weird $10 toy from the dollar store because it was cheap, and by complete accident, they handed me a gateway into what would become one of my biggest passions in the world. And yeah, the Mega Joy 2, it was a terrible way to experience these games, just like this red thing is, but I didn't care. It was the only thing I had, and I was like 3 or 4 years old. So circling back to a question from earlier, does context matter? I think the answer is yes, but maybe in the reverse order to what you'd expect. I didn't need to understand the video game crash of 1983 before I could enjoy Super Mario Brothers. I didn't need a Nintendo Power subscription. All I needed was an entry point. Once the games had me interested, they sent me backwards into discovering where all this stuff came from. I imagine most of the time kids get gifted these, it'll get 5 minutes of playtime and banished to a drawer for eternity, but I can so easily imagine a small percentage of kids for whom this crappy bootleg Famiclone is going to change their whole world, like it did for me. I'm not saying you should go buy bootleg Famiclones for your kids if for no other reason than that they're very low quality. I'm not trying to argue that bootlegging is secretly good, actually. In my case, a $10 piece of bootleg junk gave me access to a library of games that my family otherwise had absolutely no reason to seek out. I didn't have an NES. I didn't know anybody who had an NES. These games were already 20 years old, and I probably wouldn't have encountered most of them at all if somebody hadn't crammed them into this stupid controller. And the funny thing is, this bootleg didn't end up replacing the legitimate stuff for me. It had the opposite effect. Once I found out what these games actually were, I became obsessed with where they came from. Eventually, I wanted the real consoles, the cartridges, the magazines, the weird accessories, and all of the context that had been stripped away from the versions I played as a kid. Nintendo clearly understands that these games still have value too, because they never really stopped trying to find new and inventive ways to sell the NES to us again. 40 years later, Nintendo is still packaging up the same little library of games and finding new containers to put it in. These aren't abandoned pieces of software that nobody cares about anymore. Both Nintendo and their bootleggers agree that the NES is still commercially valuable. I never got to experience the NES when it was new. I experienced it as history, being accidentally handed down to me through one of the cheapest, shoddiest potential ways it could have reached me. And somehow, it worked. This thing didn't give me the authentic NES experience, but it gave me a reason to find out what that experience was like. And now, all these years later, I can look at the real consoles, read the old magazines, play with the weird accessories, and understand a little bit more about where the games I grew up with actually came from. That's the context I was missing, and weirdly enough, I only went looking for it because of this. So yeah, my first game console was an illegal bootleg. I wouldn't recommend it, but I'm really glad it was mine. Thank you to everyone on patrine.cone/cube. Thank you for pointing your eyeballs at a thing I made. I will smell you again real soon.